how at that point you can easily get sucked into other contexts by asking a question from that context without knowing it. So he is against switching contexts a lot when you're studying a philosophy. What are your thoughts in terms of studying other philosophies then? Like simultaneously, because grasping objectivism in a very grounded, automated way you're not going to wait 5 years and then study another one. That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
But
I think it depends on to what degree you're varying your studying. I generally wouldn't like use the same field and variety within the same field too much, but then it's hard to say. I mean, I don't think there's any particular danger of doing that, of misunderstanding things, as long as you keep in mind when you're specifically studying someone else and really keep it clear in your head that they are distinct people and that they could conflict. And if anything, you should like explicitly recognize that. And I don't think it's too hard to do that, as long as you're not just being lazy and just like reading and just slamming it all together. You have to be very clear on that or aware of what you're doing. I think it's not so bad if you do, but it can easily get confusing if you're not careful. Like I could easily see getting, depending on where your sources are, I think if you're doing independently, it's not so much an issue. If you're doing it at school, it's different.
Why?
Or if it was like you're studying Ayn Rand but everybody around you is like, imagine they were on less wrong and you studied philosophy there, then it can really get really messy because you're really in a social context, learning from them even what the right way to do philosophy is. I think it's better to just be independent when you study them, different philosophers.
Right. Okay.
Like go for the source material and that's that. I mean, I think it's more worth it later to get into them than once you studied objectivism for a while. I mean, it'll be more interesting then too. I mean, if you just started reading Kant right now, I don't think you'd find much value in it. But if you were to, it would get really confusing, I think, unless you just read a few primary sources just to get an idea of what he said.
Yeah. Okay. The lecture on certainty, which I skipped ahead to, he mentioned, and I told you this last time, there's no explicit method of induction, or it hasn't been valid. Well, we know it works, it just hasn't been, I don't know what you'd call it, gone through.
The theory's at best incomplete within objectivism. There's not really a theory. There's some principles, but not enough to really to say there's an inductive system that we can even have complete.
Okay.
So partial at best.
Okay, you said principles, so maybe that answers my question. I was thinking, okay, well, if that's true, isn't that the equivalent of before we had logic explicitly? It's not like you'd be wrong all the time, but you had no systematic way to self-consciously correct yourself. Therefore, error was inevitable. You'd reach a conclusion by, I don't know if it was chance, but you wouldn't always reach a logical conclusion. And so I was thinking, isn't that then similar in induction, that given that there's no theory of induction, error is inevitable?
I don't know if the error is inevitable is really the important point there, as much as you can still succeed, but it's just very difficult without a clear idea in mind. I mean, it might not even be by chance, but you're like, you don't know what to call it. You did be like, you might do it once and it's like, wait, how did I do that? And you won't know how to do it again until you just start over. But once you write it down or make it explicit, you can say, oh yeah, I'll do what I did last time and I'll do it again and it'll work again. Okay. Induction, it's not like you say, oh, I did it right this time. It's like, wait, now how do I do it again?
Right.
And it's like, you might not even know how. Just, you can do some of the things, but it's not enough.
Okay. All right. But I guess when you mentioned principles, I realized one difference between the theory of induction, which we lack, and let's say going back 2000 years or more than 2000 years, pre-Aristotelian logic, they wouldn't have had any principles, whereas we don't have a theory of induction, but we do have principles of induction. So it wouldn't be the equivalent of you're always going to
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, there's no consistent way to, I don't know if it's true to say there's no consistent way, but there is a difference. There is a significant difference between having no logic, no explicit theory of logic, and therefore not being able to self-consciously apply it, versus having some basic principles, which does not make up a full theory, but provides you with some guidance, which we do have with induction.
Yeah, like for example, like geometry preceded logic, and much of what logic was developed out of geometry, with
really?
like the logic systems and the axioms within geography or geometry.
Okay.
Like Euclid has a lot of axioms and principles, and so they do have some notion of what's going on. It's just not necessarily clear. Like we've got logic that A is A, but that A can't also be not A, things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't have that, but you had some things like the sum of the angles in a triangle are 180 degrees mean, and they knew like if you have two angles, they're like one that's 60 and one that's 40, well the other one has to be 80, and in a way that's logic. It's not strictly speaking logic, but they knew it was like, oh, that's how you know it's true when you say that your answer is right, when 80 is correct and 90 is wrong. It's illogical. It has to follow from the axioms or the rules.
It has to be consistent with them.
Yes.
Okay. All right, cool. What was I going to tell you? I forget. I'll go to the next thing. Okay, back to Ito. Oh, I'm just trying to remember what I wanted to mention. I can't remember. Okay, we'll just go to these questions. Okay, so back to definitions, which we might skip because we didn't fully get, but she was saying the equivalent, like if you designate a non-essential, whether you designate man as a Christian or a white-skinned animal or an animal, she's saying there's no difference in epistemological principle, which I actually now assume she means designation by essentials, or in practical consequences. Now, I like this about Rand. I just often I don't get how she projects, okay, well, all of this is the same, and so this will all result in some practical consequence, but I can't even see 2 steps ahead of what that even means. So you know what I'm saying? Like she's saying there's no difference in epistemological principle, which now I'm thinking, okay, maybe she means by designation by essentials, or in practical consequences, or in psychological motive. That's another thing. I have no idea how the hell, what practical consequences and what psychological motive, like how, I don't know if you have any insight to that, but I'm interested in it because to me, it's baffling that you can project that far ahead. And I don't know how she does it. And I don't know how I know it's like how to even tell if it's true or not.
Let me see the beginning of the passage. I think this is when I have to break down line by line.
Okay.
So lay the facts to mind. Okay, proposed definitions. Okay, different unique definitions. So we're talking about a anthropologist suggesting thumb possession. Yes. Thumb is the definition. Thumb haver. Okay, so seeing that the answer poses some, but it's funny. What about a man's type of consciousness? Blank out I see as rhetorical flair. I think it's just a strong way of saying that, but what about consciousness? Like what would strike him that's not even like a question? I mean, I guess you could say not intelligent enough, but he's an anthropologist. I think you can trust more than he's no smarter than that. They actually knows these sort of things. So what kind of person would say that?
I wouldn't know, but okay.
Okay. I mean, let's just say that. I mean, that it's unreasonable to suggest such a person would just think consciousness. What about that? You can even consider it. So another definition. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the defined man as Christian or white-skinned animal is the same as saying he's a language having or a thumb having, and the consequences are the same, which to me is, I do not see that connection.
Is language having a primary character? Do you have any other characters? I don't think language having is that terrible of a attempt at a definition when I think about it.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I would even disagree with Brent saying that. I mean, language is not anything a parrot does. Like, nobody thinks a parrot has a language. I don't know anybody who says so. Or if they do, that's not usually the main view. Like, parrots communicate. So I'm not even sure about the language one. I don't think that's a good example.
Well, let's go with it, because we could say communication, just swap in communication having, because the point of it is she's combining everything from thumb having to communication having to Jewish to saying there that they're all the equivalent.
Yeah, I think it's almost like a mental laziness is more what she's talking about. I don't think she's saying like, well, maybe she is saying that you're just evading it, but I'm just pointing out that they are missing something, or even part of the argument that, well, their mind is really the main purpose of these things. Like, you need to think about it more is what she's almost saying about that. Like sure, those facts might be individually true, but
I didn't even get the sense of evasion being relevant here. I just got the sense of, notice she ended the examples with white-skinned animal, then exclusively of Aryan descent to connote Nazi Germany.
Yes.
And then she brings in, okay, epistemological principle is designation by essentials, but then practical consequences. So I'm made to somehow think the practical consequences are concentration camps. And that's what interested me. Like, how the hell, you know what I'm saying? Like, from thumb having to concentration camps. Now, that is a different line of, I would say that's inductive, but it's a completely different, it's an interesting line. I just couldn't see it.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say, because you're right, there's just a big jump there. It's clear what way she's leading your reasoning. I mean, she's just progressively, I think, worse examples of not thinking in essentials, and maybe in ways that almost seem obvious. I'm trying to distinguish how she's saying that there's some negative consequence here. I mean, I know she's trying to say that messy thinking is all correlated together. Messy thinking is part of even that. Like, sure, it's a bad definition. She's saying it's rooted in an epistemological issue. It's not just that Nazis thought Jews were bad, but specifically their conceptualization of man is what's wrong, I think.
Right.
Is her claim.
Right. Okay. All right, I see that. Yeah, well, that is interesting to me, that you go from thinking about men as having thumbs and you enter concentration camps. So
yeah, it might be a bit too strong of a claim, but I do agree with the notion that messy thinking can indeed lead to terrible practical consequences. Because if you can't think clear, it means kind of what she's getting at. I think that poor thinking is really responsible for much of anything that's wrong. Even say something about the Nazis. It's not merely the fact that they killed people that was wrong, but their actual way of thinking. And she would probably claim that it's actually messy, the way they think. Right. If you really broke it down, it'd be very irrational, not on just a level of what they believe is right or wrong, but even on what is true or what is man, things like that.
Okay. Yeah, I've been trying to observe myself in conversations and reflect after them and see if I can notice if definitions are relevant to the concepts I use in the conversation, meaning after I talk, do I remember with each concept, like the thing that I consider most essential coming up? I wasn't sure. I wasn't able to tell really, if I'm honest. I can tell when I'm focused on one individual concept. Now that I've tried to, I can go, okay, man, yes, those things are important, rationality. But when I speak in a proposition or in a conversation, none of those, I don't know. It's hard for me to judge how much of what comes up and the role of the definition that it plays in a proposition. Anyway, that's something to reflect going forward. But I haven't so far been able to notice the impact of whatever work I've done conceptually clarifying in the use of propositions, only when I'm breaking down individual concepts and thinking about them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds appropriate. Sounds like one.
The issue of false, so she talks the truth or falsehood of his conclusions, inferences, thought and knowledge rest on the truth or falsehood of his definitions. This is why I was trying to introspect on conversations that I have, because I couldn't notice, maybe I'm not doing it correctly, maybe I'm not thinking about it correctly, but I just couldn't notice my definitions. I couldn't notice what was most important about the thing that comes up out of a proposition, only when I focus on the individual concept. So I couldn't tell what my mind is doing. But here she's saying that all of my conclusions, inferences, thought, and knowledge rest on my definitions, which seems motivation enough to have proper definitions, but it's not noticeable. And then okay, so now she's talking about invalid concepts and valid concepts. And I'm wondering, so you can have a false concept that's valid, but how does it work with these combinations? Like, obviously, if you have an invalid concept, then it's going to be false true, right? Like the truth or falsehood of a concept only applies to valid concepts, right?
Yeah.
But you can have a valid concept with a false that's false. That it's just something strange about that. So you can have a valid concept, but it's a false concept.
I think that reminds me of what Pika said about horizontal integration. That, like, sure, you could have the concept point, but you really need to integrate more information to do more with it. You can't just, I mean, it might be able to say, oh yeah, I could reduce it to the perceptual level, and there you go. But then, is it horizontally integrated? Have you taken into account more information? Forming the concept won't necessarily imply, I think, that you successfully took into account all the side considerations or every consideration, as much as you can reduce it, or it's connected to the perception, but it's a separate issue to what information you can take into account. Or maybe there's a different concept to use. I mean, I would think these are still concepts. Like, you could have a false but valid concept in the sense that you didn't integrate enough, or that you thought something made sense, but then it just turns out false because you discovered there's something you left out, for example.
Like what did you give? You gave the example of a chicken being a biped or a biped.
Yeah. Like, so I mean, if you never seen other, trying to think if you had, biped, you wouldn't just define it that way. I mean, it would be valid in a way, but it fails to, well, I don't know if that's a good example, because it's not valid, but it's true, is what I would say about that. It's not like a valid way to conceptualize, but I'm thinking more of science-related concepts, like the concept ether, instead of like gravity in outer space, or we used to think there was actual substance of outer space, so they call it ether, which wouldn't be necessarily wrong, I think, by observation from the tools we've had. But once you actually get there, it's quite obviously false, because you see that you've integrated with more information. Like, when you actually got there, you could say, like, oh, there's more information here that I didn't realize before.
Okay. I didn't fully follow that example, but I got enough of what you were saying, which I think is that you can have a valid concept, like you are referring, the point is you're referring to something that exists, like a chicken, but you're calling it a biped. So in that sense, it's false because there's integrations to be made horizontally that you haven't, that would not contradict. I don't even know if contradict is the right word, but that would make that a non-functional concept. I'm not sure if I got that
Well,
right.
more so even just when you discover something in science or think you've discovered something, but then you find out it's wrong because you horizontally integrated more information, say from other fields.
Okay. Right.
That's more what I'm focusing on.
So if you have an invalid concept, it can lead to a cognitive dead end. And that makes sense because if you're not referring to any particular thing, then in a sense, you're just constructing castles in the air, right? You can't.
I mean, those would just be false and invalid if you're just castles in the air, because you didn't even try to connect it to perception. It's just, as you said, a castle. It's not even attempted.
It's easier to do that, by the way. I notice with my questions, I'll go with the abstraction, but I still don't even know, like I don't have examples of the abstraction, and then I can make a million questions out of the abstraction.
That's why I try to use examples like that. I mean, science has a lot of these examples. That's why just history of science is very useful for examples.
Right. So that would be a case also for learning science, science, at least some basic science.
Yes.
Okay, so what about a badly defined concept? Is that also, would you say that's a cognitive dead end? Or like what happens there?
See, I'm not sure what Rand thinks on that exactly, because I do get a bit confused when she said the truth or falsehood of your conclusions rest on your definitions. I see that it matters, but I don't see the other truth or falsehood.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm not sure what she thinks on that.
So I think we discussed this about defining other concepts in terms of other concepts, the exceptions being sensations and metaphysical axioms. But then I thought about like, well, smoke, how would I define smoke in terms of, okay, so it's a gray thing and it floats and moves around while it floats. I guess that would be it, right? Like, but some are not easy, or like even water. Like if you never saw water before, how would you define that in terms of other concepts?
I mean, liquid for one, because it's maybe the more apparent quality of it, would probably be, you would initially might say it's a type of liquid, because that's also so ubiquitous across the universe.
Right.
So even if you're from another planet, you probably go, oh, liquid, some kind of liquid. It does something special, but all I know for now is liquid.
But then liquid, could you define liquid itself then? Let's go back to just liquid. You'd need to observe. You can't get liquid unless you've observed liquids, like actual liquids, right? So water.
I think more than one kind even.
Yeah,
even generalize into liquid.
Liquid is an abstraction, so that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I sort of see. Yeah. Okay. Wind.
Or if you did define, if you did have the concept liquid already, that's where you would start, because then you'd see, oh, because it's a liquid, I can know something about it for now, probably.
Right.
That if it is a liquid, I'll know that it could become a solid. Or if it's a liquid, I know that I usually can put my body through it. It might not be essential, but in things like that, it can help you understand it. If you're trying to define it, you might look, well, what about these properties are special? I mean, eventually you might discover like freezing point might be distinguishing, things like that.
And then wind would be something like a force pressing on you, invisible. And I wonder what other analogy.
Invisible natural force, maybe. I mean, Aristotle distinguished it. I think that as natural movement, I think that's what he called it.
Well, so you'd basically be describing the characteristics of it. Comes with thunderstorms, like because something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, those would be non-essentials, but yeah, you would start thinking about these things
Yeah.
if you're defining it. Then you might
Okay.
think like, oh yeah, like a
Oh.
force is like, that's the genus, that's the general thing we're describing here. But it is a bit.
Okay, I see. I get it. But
Yeah.
no, this is cool because it's just showing you that all knowledge is interrelated, basically. That like
Yeah.
everything can be described in terms of everything else.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's Da Vinci was all about that. Like everything is related, everything is connected. The universe is one. I always thought that was all just spiritual mumbo jumbo. But
I got a paper about Aristotle's book Physics. I think was pretty interesting because it was describing the way even just how Aristotle thought of these things, like how he was breaking it down from different types of movement, and then where the movement occurs, like within like a liquid, for example.
what do
And
you
just
mean
the ways,
movement?
just like physics, and how does the nature of the way things move. Say if you drop a penny into a lake, how fast would it fall? Things like that. It's pretty
I see.
interesting how he divides these things just observationally to start and derives some valid principles from that, but really just starting with like some general observations and building from those.
Okay. Have you read physics, or is this just the paper on physics?
It was about the book Physics. So
The book was metaphysics, right?
he wrote physics and then metaphysics.
I always thought that it was just metaphysics, and then the subject of physics came from his book on metaphysics. But
Well, actually, I don't know
okay.
the order, but
Okay.
I mean, there's physics and there's metaphysics.
Okay.
Physics being like what we think of as things that move in the way that like Da Vinci or Galileo did it, versus
Okay.
metaphysics being like the broader principles of just the nature of what exists in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. I get this one, so we can. Do you have any good by the way, do you have any questions that you ask yourself when you're looking for analogies or metaphors?
Well, what do you mean looking for metaphors? Like what kind of situation are you thinking?
I'm just trying to, so let's say I'm thinking about what I'm doing now, and I want to come up I want to come up with a metaphor for what I'm doing now. So I'm in a tutorial. Do you just simply go, what does this remind me of? Or do you have some questions that you like asking?
Well, first question is, what does it remind me of? Yes. And that's one thing I ask myself. It's hard to say what I often feel like it appears to me, but maybe it's because I have to introspect on that more. I think it might be because I'm setting my mind in the context of our discussion and trying to let my imagination go a bit, let my associations, try to keep track of them in my head. Like if you say Da Vinci, I pictured him like sitting in a laboratory, like just for a moment, like I let my imagination go at the same time. That's kind of what I noticed myself doing.
Okay.
Like when we were talking about water, when you said, imagine you discovered water, I just pictured an alien visiting a lake, a very big lake with no people. That's what I visualized just for a brief moment.
Okay, so I'll just have to keep experimenting with these and trying to find analogies like Da Vinci. I need to get some deer carcasses so I can blow up their stomachs like he did too. I think a lot of it would be if you have a head full of emotional images, that would help. But if you don't, and you're a rationalist who sits like me, who sits thinking about things, then maybe it's not as powerful as if you had a lot of vivid images. Anyway,
I think so.
I just remembered, I read something about Richard Feynman, and there was a paper in physics that he kept saying he doesn't understand it. He can't understand it. And people were like, what are you talking about? You can't understand it. It's just because you didn't invent it. You can't understand it. But it's because when he read something, it wasn't enough for him to know. I found this interesting. It wasn't enough for him to know what it was referring to. He needed to know how they got there, meaning he would reduce everything So when he'd read about a theory in physics, he'd recreate the experiments. That's how he'd learn it.
Yeah.
And so it seemed ridiculous, but I'd say that's a form of reduction. And on top of that, it's reduction with actual physical experiments that make your mind better at finding analogies and patterns. Because if you don't do the experiments and you just read the text, it's different. So I found that pretty interesting. It's him. And then you take Musk always talking about reducing it to the physics all the time, or first principles. So it's similar.
Yeah, I think so. Very similar.
Okay.
Another thing I do is if I'm reading about one subject, I might deliberately think of how does this relate to what I was thinking about earlier. Like I'll often read about two different subjects in a day. So it's not too bad to say, what's the relationship between these two? Are there any concepts in this new idea that are in this old one? Like say, if I'm studying trying to think of an example. Maybe if I read a newspaper article about a medical study, I might then think about something I was reading earlier about, say, farming habits and newer farming habits in the US.
Okay.
And they're not explicitly connected. Like say a health diet study, I can maybe think about, well, how does these new discoveries, how do they relate to the way people eat, or how do farms work? Is there a relationship between like changing health, changing awareness in health, things like that? It's just trying to make connections by connecting those two things I read about in a day, and just seeing what I can do between them.
There was a lecture so I think it was the lecture on, I think it was on certainty, and Peikoff was talking about some studies showing the correlation between deaths in India and commas in the New York Times. And it was the point was the context was statistics can be used to show anything.
Yeah.
And it made me think though, because this idea that all knowledge is interrelated, I'm still not really clear on how it plays out. Because in a sense, if you're saying all knowledge is interrelated, then you are saying, okay, the commas in the New York Times are related to deaths in India. That everything is causally related. But on the other hand, if I just think about that not from a philosophical perspective, but simply like common sense, how I normally think, well, no, it's not related. It's got nothing to do with it. And that I don't have my head around that, because then you'd be able to say, like, well, I'm walking down the street eating a banana, and yes, it relates to the microphone on my desk that's made in China. Like, no, it's not. But philosophically, if I'm saying all knowledge is interrelated, that's what I'm saying. And that's what I'm not that clear on still. But I remember you recommended unity in epistemology and ethics, which I've only gone through part of it. So maybe that's something I'll have to pick up again once I've gone through the whole. Were there other lectures also somewhat relevant to that?
That's all I could think of.
Yeah, okay.
Those primarily.
Right. So let's see what this question is. I understood this. The bolded part is relevant. So most people therefore regard, so she's talking about those definitions, those concepts that the simple concepts that are hardest to define are the first ones we form, and they're defined verbally only. You can only define them later by means of other concepts, like table and flat level surface support, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's because of this that that you start to regard definitions in general as unnecessary, because you get confused between the simple concepts and the more abstract ones. For example, freedom. Freedom to me means running down the street naked. Freedom to him means freedom from government force. Freedom to the other person means freedom to not work.
Yeah.
And so it's because of that process of even actually isn't Nassim Taleb and the example I gave you of Fat Tony versus the example of Fat Tony versus Socrates an example of this, that because some concepts are simple and we form them early, we can think that no definitions, and there's no need to identify the essence of something. That's an example of this, isn't it?
I would say so.
And so she's then explaining that there's a psychological justification for this policy. The discriminated awareness begins with percepts, and because they're so thoroughly automated, you've got no difficulty in. So it's basically making, this makes sense to me now. It's making the case that you can understand why people fall into this trap, because you do use concepts on a daily basis, many of which you don't need to define, and they function just fine.
Yeah, I could see somebody saying, well, it's common sense. You don't need to define these things. Like, oh, just look how we think about a house. It's just common sense what it is. So it's common sense what freedom is. And if you're trying to define it, it just means maybe you're rationalizing, or you don't really get it, or I mean, that would be just a standard way of doing it, like a non-intellectual, just like a day-to-day person is like, well, I know what it means because I feel in my bones or whatever.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's not that far off, but it's messy and unreliable.
Right. So if you wanted then this is then the key, is to grasp the consequences of remaining on that level only, and then muddling your definitions on the being able to clearly define, being able to clearly identify the different kinds of concepts on the various levels of the hierarchy, and the consequences of not defining the higher level ones, but properly using the lower level ones, which I don't know, but I imagine that you could probably capture that concretely with many examples, and that would be like a marketing or selling point for someone who wants to know about philosophy, because you're like, yeah, it's true. Like Fat Tony shows you don't need to define milk, but then look at what happens when you don't define should, or if you don't define freedom, or if you don't define wealth or whatever. I don't know. You probably, I feel like that's the entry point then to motivate yourself. But
even with Feynman, you're saying like he knows when he's in which level of abstraction he's at. It's not just all concepts. Like he's aware when they're abstract like concepts, and he's aware that there's a difference between concepts that you see for yourself. Like he's aware that there's a difference between the abstract and the concrete, and he does treat them different methodologically, and he's able to think about those things because he's thought about it efficiently, not just out of sheer ability to think about these things, but thinking efficiently.
There's something actually it's a side note, but I thought you might be interested, since you're interested in creativity and intuition. And let's see, here we go. So it's talking about, I'm reading a book, and it's talking about his amazing intuition that he had for just like instantly solving problems before they were even, the full problem was stated. And I'll see if I'll. Okay, so his mental calculation feats seem impressive to us, but were trivial to him because he happened to know so many mathematical patterns. Like chess grandmasters, when given real physics problems, he excelled because he had built a huge library of patterns from real experiences with physics. And going back to what I mentioned before, he'd recreate experiments when he wanted to learn something. He wouldn't just climb up the hierarchy, someone else's hierarchy stated in abstractions. And now it says this: however, his intuition too would fail him when the subject of his study wasn't built on those assumptions, meaning real-world assumptions. Feynman's mathematical friends would test him on counterintuitive theorems from mathematics. His intuition there would fail when properties of the procedure, such as that an object can be cut into infinitely small pieces, defied the normal physical limitations that aided his intuition elsewhere. Meaning his intuition was based on reality-based patterns, but if you gave him something that wasn't reality-based, like some, from what I understood, artificial creation in mathematics, where the normal rules of reality don't apply, he wouldn't have that intuition anymore, which I found really interesting. because it's a case for the intuition being built on experiments, real world testing and things like that. And analysis.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like he was more of a science-minded person. Not that those things in math are always arbitrary. There's topography theory is usually, it's not that it's based on your reality, but in the same way that like geometry or it's based on like triangles, like you don't see the perfect triangle in the sense that you see a triangle of 180 degrees exactly. They're in some way constructed for logical thought and purposes. So like a problem like that in math is usually strictly about logical structure or even how you could reason things out. And his intuition couldn't really work that way because that's not how he built up all his thinking or his intuition, that he'd had to use different principles to get the right answer because everything he trained on just doesn't apply.
Yeah, there's actually something else that I found. Let's see. Here. So this guy sent me an email, asked him about thinking methods in philosophy as applied to, he's an engineer. Many engineers had this Platonic view. To them, engineering was the application of formulas to the derivation of which they did not fully understand, so they would apply them inappropriately. This became rampant with the use of computer simulation. Yes. Something was true because the simulator says it's true. The simulator used Maxwell's equations, which are true. In some cases, simplifying assumptions are made in the simulator, which the engineer did not know. In all cases, the simulator depends on the accuracy of describing all the boundary conditions. Such descriptions trade off accuracy for computation time, often prohibitive computation time. Engineer after engineer would point to the results of the simulation and say that it is the truth. I spent large amounts of time insisting that engineers compare everything they simulate to physical measurements. They rarely matched. It was the Platonic reification of math and simulation I was fighting, and weak appreciation for the facts of reality. This is exactly the kind of thing HP has been talking about in the forum, blah, blah, blah. And then he gives more examples of someone like if you use a formula with no simplifying assumptions, the velocity approaches the speed of light asymptotically. Then he's saying, I suggested to this guy to go to the lab. It would only take 10 minutes to test that this is not true. But it makes me think of, when you study maths just in the abstract without reference to, I don't know, experiments or reality, you can forget and get caught up in things that maybe they're useful for doing actual tools in using maths, but not in understanding reality.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. But
yeah, I think they misapply what the principles supposed to be used for. Like it's easy to misapply principles in physics, thinking that just because the computation was done means you've taken into account every possible contingency, or that the model itself is necessarily captured everything. You've abstracted some things away to get some general principle or idea, but each concrete case isn't always quite the same because there's more considerations beyond that model.
Right.
And the model can if you know what the model is, and that is supposed to be an unreal case, just to examine, like, say, the possibility of something, or if this were the case, what would happen? And then you can start testing, well, as I gradually add things that are true in reality, will I break the model? I mean, that's the right way to think about model building usually.
Okay.
You gradually add things and watch it break. And when it breaks, it's like, oh, there's something different there. And that'd be more like the way you would want to think about it.
I get it. All right. So you could say that the model, so you're recreating some aspect of the phenomena by abstracting away certain conditions or factors. And then what you're doing, you're almost creating a hypothesis. You're testing, are those factors both necessary and sufficient and causally relevant? And you do that by then playing around with the model, I think you said, and then what was the wording you used? Then going into reality and seeing if it still holds. How did you explain it?
keep adding things from reality until it breaks. But if it breaks,
Okay.
you discovered a new, something's different there. Something about
Yeah.
your assumptions had to be wrong.
Okay.
Otherwise, it would work.
So you keep adding things from reality to the model?
Yeah, until it breaks, until the model breaks.
Right. And then
Like it just, oh, go ahead.
So is the idea that, so you're adding factors from reality, is this related to, Peikoff talks about there are different kinds of errors you can make in inductive generalization. So one is when your method is good and you've simply not accounted for a factor, so you're wrong. And just like the blood types, he talks about the blood types. And you say all blood A's are compatible, and then you learn about the RH factor, which is an example of that. Another way you can go wrong or error is in the method. So like you calculate a column of numbers and you've made some mistake in the method, which is different. There's no unaccounted for factor there. There's just an error in method. Is what you're explaining now with adding more factors from reality until the model breaks an example of the first error where you're trying to identify causal factors?
Well, it's a good way to identify causal factors if you do it that way, because you're deliberately recognizing you have a model and trying to see where the model differs from reality is different than seeing the model is reality. Therefore, it's right when you put in a problem or put in the input. That's what I'm saying. The error would be to forget that there's a distinction between the model and reality, to forget that you've abstracted away would be the problem there, which is what that guy would be saying, that these people are abusing the use of models. I've studied enough computational modeling, at least abstractly, to know what it's for, to know that an engineer should never treat it like the answer is just a way of approximating reality in some way, that the model is your best understanding given what you know, but you always know there's something missing, or you always recognize that you've abstracted away details. So the better your model would be, the more it can take into account. So if it can't take into account something, then you know for sure that you've left something out. I mean, that might be something you do when you're trying to investigate how the human mind works. Like you can make an algorithm that replicates human performance on some puzzle, but you keep changing the puzzle in a way until that you can no longer predict human behavior. Then well, this is something different about humans and people. There's something else this is something the algorithm can't take into account.
So you're looking at the algorithm or the model in relation to this new problem and trying to identify what factor is the cause of, so it gives you a lead. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think there's a principle in deriving there from what I'm trying to express. I think is something from I forget which philosopher, Mill, the philosopher Mill.
All those ideas of induction. I know he did like numerical induction and
I think that's one of them here. Like there's an elimination version or something where you keep taking out factors or keep adding factors until you find the one that makes a difference. Things like that.
Hey, I read some more. I was just skimming through Talbot's book, and it was interesting. So he's very much into Popper, and a lot of business people are. And he mentioned that a lot of discoveries were not, obviously the people who discovered them were genius, but they were not looking for that specific thing they discovered, like penicillin, which was, he described it as a mistake, or even the discovery of America. They were trying to discover a route to India or China.
Yeah.
And so he uses that to I think he makes the case that, sometimes we're not, it is just this blind guesswork. It's not, there's no like genius with a vision of where he's going to end up exactly. It's more just a process of discovery. And I was thinking it would be really useful then to know actually the history of science, because it's easy. It might be easy to then think that you need to be some great visionary to discover something, as opposed to someone who's just working consistently to try combinations of things.
An exploration mindset. Exploration is really the key there, more so than anything. Like you can see that with Da Vinci and anyone else you mentioned, they really explore things more than they are like, I know the answer and I know what I want to do. It's like,
Right.
well, I'm exploring, seeing what is the answer, just seeing what's there.
It's good to think about that, because I thought maybe I
True.
do need to have like a long-term vision for myself.
True.
But then I also read I've been skimming tons of books. I read another book, or I read like 10 pages out of the book. I consider it read because the rest was irrelevant. And it talked about this idea from business of fire bullets, not cannonballs, which I've heard many times before stated in different language. But they gave an example of a company. I think it's called Amgen. I don't know if you've heard of Amgen, but
Sounds
the
familiar.
way Amgen started was a few venture capitalists put together money, and they just said, all right, let's just start a pharmaceutical company. We don't know what we're going to do, but let's just hire good people. And I'll see if I find it. Oh, here it is. Okay. So two venture capitalists, they just got together a group of scientists and inventors. They had no plan, no product, no direction at all. They just had an advisory board and some money to invest. And they're like, let's just throw heaps of money at what was called recombinant DNA technology. We don't know what the hell is going to happen. We're just going to throw lots of money on it. And they had it lists here all the bullets. So they just researched all this random stuff like leukocyte interferon for viral diseases, hepatitis B. They've got like a huge list here. And they ended up finding one thing that showed promise. They developed that and it turned into Amgen. But it wasn't like they had this big vision to develop some final specific thing. It was just, let's just get together smart people, throw money at different things and see what happens. So it made me think a lot about is like a long-term vision necessary or not. It kind of throws a spanner in my understanding of that. So
I would almost say that the motivation is just some wider interest, at least, about pharmaceuticals. I mean, you might not know exactly what kind of product you want, but
yeah,
I think you probably know enough about vision as far as, do you want to create great medicines or something? Or even if it's not like something you've explored much, you can still have those goals, or even just whatever broad goal it might be. I think you would still need that. Like,
yeah, maybe you're right.
It depends though. I mean, sometimes it's a matter of like some ideas just take off really easily and they're just more powerful than others.
Yeah.
So you might necessarily need a strong sense of what you're going for. But for the long term, of course, like, well, what about maintaining the business for like 10 years or 20 years? What about the next product? I think that's usually when those things come in more so. Your vision, what your desires is like, it's not like you don't want to be a one-hit wonder. You want to consistently do well and produce these things that you do. For that, you would need the vision, not just this, one time I came up with this cool song and that was it. Never did it again.